"Dad, you had this all this time and let me go hungry." A homeless man finds a baby in a trash bag and raises him as his own. 18 years later, the young man discovers the shocking secret his father hid. If, on the same night you found an abandoned baby, you also discovered a fortune that could change your life forever, what would you choose? The true value of life is not measured in gold bars, but in how much we are willing to love without expecting anything in return. The rain battered the streets of Manhattan that night, a chilling veil covering the dark, silent alleys. The biting wind howled between the buildings like a lament, and the few people still wandering the sidewalks pulled their coats tighter around themselves for protection against the cold. But Gideon had no coat. He only owned a tattered old blanket that he wrapped around his shoulders as he moved among the crates and trash bins, searching for any scraps of food. His calloused fingers rummaged through damp garbage bags, the rough skin cracking in the chill. It was just another ordinary night in his life as a homeless man, weighed down by hunger and the humiliation of having to sift through the refuse of a world that no longer saw him. Gideon couldn't remember how long he had been there. Time seemed to dissolve into a gray fog, days and nights blending together without meaning. Just survive. That was all that remained. He pulled a cardboard box lid over himself to shield against the rain and crouched near a dumpster. His breath puffed out in white clouds. The city never slept, but in the alleys, life felt suspended, swallowed by the indifference of those rushing by on brightly lit avenues just a few blocks away. Then he heard it. Faint, almost inaudible amidst the drip of water from the rooftops. A high-pitched sound cut through by the wind. Gideon furrowed his brow and turned his head. Seconds later, he heard it again. A cry. His chest tightened. It couldn't be. No one would leave a baby there, not on a night like this. He hesitated, muscles tense, trying to distinguish where the sound was coming from. Then he saw something moving among the piled trash bags against a wall. Gideon approached, feeling a chill run up his spine. With trembling hands, he pulled one of the bags, which gave way easily, and his eyes widened at what he saw inside. A baby! He blinked several times, as if his mind refused to process what he was seeing. A child, wrapped in rags, its face red and wet with tears, skin cold like the concrete around it. The baby cried in a hoarse sob, as if life itself hung by a thread. Gideon felt his heart race, his throat went dry. "My God," he murmured, kneeling down. He extended his hands, hesitating. Many questions formed in his mind, but none made sense at that moment. Who would do something like this? Who would abandon a baby in a trash bag on such a cruel night? Gently, he took the child into his arms. It was light, absurdly small, and for a moment, the image of another time flashed through his mind. A time when he held his own newborn daughter, before life took everything from him. He swallowed hard and pushed that thought away. Not now. The baby nestled against his chest, tiny fingers curling involuntarily into the fabric of his tattered shirt. Gideon looked around, searching for anyone, any sign of who might have done this. But the alley was empty, only the sound of the rain filling the suffocating silence. That's when he noticed something else inside the trash bag. A golden glimmer, hidden beneath the filthy rags. His eyes narrowed as he reached in with his free hand and pulled out one of the objects. It was a gold bar. Gideon stood still. He felt the solid weight in the palm of his hand, cold and gleaming, reflecting the faint light from the nearest street lamp. He blinked, his mind struggling to comprehend. Was this real? His gaze returned to the bag. There was more. He counted quickly. 10 gold bars, all identical. The air around him seemed to freeze. What did this mean? Who had left it there? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do? For a moment, his instincts shouted at him. Take the gold and go. He could sell one of the bars and escape this misery. He could rent a room, get decent clothes, start over. Maybe even find a way to care for that baby without it having to know the hell of the streets. The opportunity was right there, just inches from his fingers. But then he looked at the child. Small, defenseless, snuggling against him as if he were the only shelter it had ever known. And in that moment, Gideon knew. The gold was dangerous. He had seen too many men killed for much less on the streets. If he tried to sell it, he would have to be careful. Many would do anything for something like that. He scanned the area, making sure no one was watching. He shoved the bars into the burlap sack he carried and hugged the baby close to his chest. He needed to make a decision. Fast. If he stayed there too long, someone might show up. Then an idea struck him. On the next block, he knew of a group that engaged in shady dealings. They dealt with stolen goods, jewelry, anything that could be quickly traded for cash. If he could sell just one bar, he could get some money to start fresh. The rain intensified as he left the alley, his steps firm and his gaze sweeping the shadows. Each heartbeat felt like a drum in his chest. After a few corners, he arrived at the location. An old abandoned warehouse with a single street lamp illuminating the damp sidewalk. He hesitated for a moment, looking down at the baby sleeping in his arms, the little face serene, as if nothing could harm it. Gideon took a deep breath and stepped inside. The smell of tobacco and mildew was strong. 3 men sat at the back, playing cards at a worn wooden table. One of them looked up as he entered. "What do you want, Gideon?" grunted the man, arms crossed. Gideon reached into the sack and pulled out the gold bar, raising it for them to see. Silence fell instantly over the room. The 3 men exchanged glances. "Where did you get this?" one of them asked, slowly standing up. Gideon felt the air grow heavy. "It doesn't matter. I just want to sell," he said, trying to sound confident. The man who appeared to be the leader approached, took the bar from his hand, and examined it under the dim light. "This is real gold," he murmured, narrowing his eyes, fixing his gaze on Gideon. "And you, a beggar, just happened to come by it?" The tension thickened. Gideon knew at that moment he had made a mistake. The men began to move, closing in around him. "Are you trying to deceive us, Gideon?" One of them stepped forward, fingers brushing something under his coat. "If you stole this from someone, who's to say that someone won't come after us later?" Gideon felt his blood run cold. He instinctively clutched the baby, shielding it with his body. The leader smiled cruelly. "I don't think you're going to walk out of here so easily." Then everything happened too fast. Gideon spun on his heels and ran. He heard chairs scraping, voices cursing behind him. He felt heavy footsteps pounding on the floor. He ran without looking back, his legs burning with effort. He burst through the door, felt the cold air against his skin, and dove into the alley. Behind him, the men shouted. He ran like he had never run before. The baby was now crying, frightened by the sudden movement. Gideon tightened his grip around it, shielding it from the rain and the looming danger. He turned corners, crossed empty streets. His lungs burned, but he didn't stop. He only halted when he was sure no one was following him anymore. He fell to his knees under an awning, shoulders heaving. The baby was still crying, and Gideon hugged it tightly. The gold was not a blessing, it was a curse. And from that moment on, he knew there was only one thing to do. He would take care of that child, with or without gold. The rain had eased to a fine drizzle when Gideon finally allowed himself to stop and breathe. He was leaning against the damp wall of an abandoned building, his muscles burning after the long run. The baby in his arms was crying softly, exhausted from the cold and the turmoil of the night. Gideon looked down at the small, rosy face and felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to care for a child. But one thing was certain. He couldn't let him die. Pulling the tattered blanket he had been carrying, he wrapped the child as best as he could. He needed to find a dry place, and, more urgently, food. A baby needed milk, and he didn't have a single cent. The thought of the gold crossed his mind, but was quickly dismissed. He had learned the hard way that gold would only bring him trouble. He scanned the alleys around him. He needed a plan. St. Helena Shelter. He rarely went there. He preferred to avoid the pitying looks and the sermons from the volunteers who tried to convince him to seek a new path. But now, with a baby in his arms, he had no choice. Hurrying his steps, he navigated the empty streets. Manhattan never slept, but at that hour, the sidewalks were occupied only by wandering souls like him. The baby was quiet now, his little face buried against Gideon's chest. Gideon felt a strange warmth in his heart. For the first time in years, someone was trusting him to protect them. He arrived at the shelter just before dawn. St. Helena was a simple but well-kept building, a refuge for those who had lost everything. He hesitated for a moment before entering, feeling the weight of his decision. Inside, the smell of hot soup and weak coffee filled the air. A few people were scattered around the hall, huddled in blankets or waiting to get a meal. No one noticed his arrival at first, but then a soft voice called his attention. "Gideon?" He turned and saw Ophelia. She was one of the volunteers who worked there, always willing to help, even when most homeless people treated her with indifference or distrust. With her brown hair pulled into a messy bun and a firm look, she seemed to carry a weight greater than her youth suggested. "What?" She interrupted herself upon noticing the baby in his arms. Her eyes widened. "My God, what happened?" "I found him," Gideon replied, his voice hoarse. He saw the shock on her face, followed by a look of urgency. "He needs food and clothes. I don't know what to do." Ophelia didn't hesitate. With a quick movement, she took the baby from his arms, evaluating him with an experienced gaze. "He's cold and malnourished, but he'll be okay." She looked at Gideon with a mix of distrust and curiosity. "Where did you find this child?" Gideon looked away. "In an alley, thrown in the trash." The silence that followed was heavy. Ophelia took a deep breath and, without asking any more questions, took the baby to one of the tables, where she grabbed a clean blanket and began to wrap him up. "Wait here," she said before disappearing through a side door. Gideon stood still, feeling the gaze of a few people on him. He didn't like it. But then he heard a small sound, a low whimper from the baby, and realized that, at that moment, nothing else mattered. Ophelia returned minutes later with a bottle. "I got warm milk," she said, as she sat down and started to feed the child. Gideon watched in fascination as the baby suckled eagerly. "Have you thought about taking him to a hospital?" Ophelia asked, not taking her eyes off the child. "I can't," he replied quickly. She raised an eyebrow. Why not? Gideon hesitated. He couldn't explain. He just felt that if he went to the police or a hospital, they would take the baby away from him. He couldn't let that happen. He was abandoned, he finally said. If I hadn't found him, he would already be dead. I can't leave him alone. Ophelia studied him for a long moment before letting out a sigh. All right, but you need help. This baby can't grow up on the streets. She stood up and went to a cabinet, returning with a small bundle of baby clothes. Here, take this, and come back tomorrow. Gideon took the clothes, unsure of what to say. Then he simply nodded. In the following nights, Gideon improvised a refuge. He found an abandoned building a few blocks away, a dilapidated warehouse with a room that still had a relatively intact roof. There, he organized a corner for the baby, using pieces of cardboard and fabric he collected. And it was there that he decided to hide the gold. In the back of the room, he found an old, dusty wooden box, forgotten and neglected. It was perfect for hiding the bars. He placed the ingots inside and shoved the box under a pile of debris. Now no one would find them. The baby, for his part, seemed to be getting stronger. Fed with Ophelia's help, his color improved, and he began to react to stimuli, babbling and kicking his little legs in the air. Gideon watched him in fascination. He never imagined that such a small life could have such an impact. And one day, without thinking, he called him my son. The word slipped from his lips before he could stop it. He froze, but he didn't take it back. Ezekiel. That was the name he would give to the baby. Days turned into weeks. Gideon fell into a routine. During the day, he begged for change, scavenged for food scraps, and returned to the shelter to gather supplies for Ezekiel. At night, he went back to the abandoned building and protected the boy from the cold. But as time passed, a worry began to grow. He knew he couldn't continue like this forever. The baby needed more. He needed a real home, not an improvised corner between exposed brick walls. Gold. The thought haunted him. If he sold just one bar, he could afford a small room, proper food. He could change their lives. But the trauma of what had happened before held him back. He closed his eyes and relived the scene. The men advancing, fists clenched, the veiled threat. He knew he wouldn't be so lucky a second time. But what if? What if he tried with someone else? Someone less dangerous? The idea grew in his mind. That night, while Ezekiel slept, he opened the wooden box and held one of the bars. It felt heavy in his hand, as solid and real as the responsibility he now bore. If he could just sell one. He looked at the baby and hesitated. His heart raced. He knew that the moment he took that bar and sought out someone, he would open a door that might never close again. Slowly, he placed the gold back in the box. Not yet. But how long could he avoid that decision? The answer came in the form of a weak whimper. Ezekiel had woken, his little face scrunched up in discomfort. Gideon immediately forgot the gold. He picked the baby up, cradling him gently, and murmured, "You're safe, my son, I promise." And for the first time, he wondered if he would ever be able to keep that promise. Gideon's life changed forever the moment he found Ezekiel abandoned in the cold. Now, he must figure out how to keep the child safe while battling hunger, cold, and the dangers of the streets. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and comment. Your support helps this channel grow and bring you more emotional stories. Now, let's see how Gideon fights to protect his son. Thank you. 3 years had passed since Gideon found the baby. The cold wind sliced through the early morning like blades as Ezekiel began to cough. At first, it was just a muffled sound, an occasional clearing of the throat that Gideon ignored, believing it was merely the chill of the night irritating the boy's small airways. But as the days went by, the cough intensified, becoming deep and raspy, accompanied by wheezing in his chest. That night, lying on the makeshift blanket on the floor of the abandoned building, Gideon felt the feverish body of the boy against his own. Heat radiated from Ezekiel's sweaty forehead, and Gideon realized the child was genuinely ill. Panic surged in his chest. He had nothing to offer but tight hugs and silent prayers. The boy stirred, his tiny fingers clutching at Gideon's worn jacket. "Daddy!" The word slipped from the boy's lips like a fragile whisper, and Gideon felt something inside him crumble. He had never taught Ezekiel to call him that, but somehow it had happened naturally. The love between them had grown inexorably, silently, and now Gideon felt the weight of an overwhelming responsibility. Without wasting time, he wrapped Ezekiel in a blanket and held him against his chest. The boy felt limp, his eyes half closed, his breathing labored. Gideon knew he needed help, and fast. He ran through the silent streets of Manhattan until he reached Jefferson Public Hospital. The brick building, worn and weathered, was a refuge for those who could not afford better hospitals. Upon entering, the smell of disinfectant mixed with old coffee hit him. Plastic chairs creaked under the weight of patients huddled in blankets, waiting for treatment. Gideon crossed the lobby and went straight to the reception desk. "My son is sick," he said, his voice trembling. "He has a high fever and won't stop coughing." The attendant, a woman with a weary expression, looked up and assessed the boy. "Fill out this form and wait for your name to be called." "He can't wait," Gideon insisted, but the woman merely pointed to the chairs. With no choice, he sat down, holding Ezekiel close. The boy was breathing heavily, and each passing minute felt like an eternity. Time dragged on until finally his name was called. The doctor, a middle-aged man with deep bags under his eyes, examined Ezekiel and diagnosed him with pneumonia. "He needs strong antibiotics and rest," the doctor said, scribbling a prescription. "We'll give him an initial dose, but you'll need to buy the rest of the medication." Gideon felt his stomach drop. "I don't have any money." The doctor sighed. "The hospital provides basic treatment, but without the rest of the medication, he could get worse. Try a shelter. Ask for help." Guilt crushed Gideon as he held Ezekiel in his arms and left the hospital. He needed that medication, and he knew how to get it. The gold. Back at the abandoned building, he opened the wooden box. The bars were there, gleaming in the dark. If he sold just one, he could afford the best treatment for Ezekiel. He could buy a warm place to sleep, proper food. He picked up one of the bars and held it tightly. He took a deep breath and made his decision. The alley where the receivers operated was darker than he remembered. The smell of alcohol and urine lingered in the air. Gideon hesitated for a moment before moving forward. The men were there, the same ones who had nearly killed him last time. His stomach churned, but then he looked at the bar in his hand. For Ezekiel, he would face anything. "I'm back to do business," he said, his voice steady. The eyes of the man in front gleamed with dangerous interest. "Interesting. You disappeared last time. Where did you get this?" Gideon swallowed hard. "It doesn't matter. I want to sell." The man laughed. "And why should I trust you now?" He stepped closer, and Gideon felt the weight of the threat in every word. Instinct screamed inside him. He was making a mistake. One wrong move, and he wouldn't return to Ezekiel. The man took the bar from Gideon's hand, spinning it between his fingers. "Let's see if this is real this time." He signaled to another thug, who brought a small blowtorch. Gideon felt a chill. It was then that something inside him broke. The memory of the last time, the clenched fists, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. And now he was about to repeat it all? He thought of Ezekiel. If something happened to him here, the boy would be left alone. Without hesitation, Gideon snatched the bar back and stepped back. "I changed my mind." "What?" The look in the man's eyes darkened and he started to move. Gideon didn't wait. He turned and ran, his heart pounding. The sound of footsteps behind him pursued him for a few seconds, but soon faded away. When he reached the abandoned building, he fell to his knees beside Ezekiel, who was sleeping peacefully. He held the boy tightly, feeling his small body snuggle against him. Never again. He would never try to sell that damn gold again. Days later, at the St. Helena shelter, Gideon encountered a new face among the volunteers. It was an elderly woman with gray hair and a penetrating gaze. "You're the man who takes care of the boy?" she asked, her voice laden with wisdom. He nodded. "My name is Ms. Aldridge. I've seen how you care for him, but I wonder, why not seek an easier solution?" Her eyes were too analytical. Gideon felt a shiver but maintained his composure. "I don't trust easy solutions." She smiled faintly. "That says a lot about you." She handed him a small bag with bread and fruit. "Take care of yourself." As she walked away, Gideon felt something different. It was as if that woman could see right through him. He watched her for a long time, unaware that sooner or later, Ms. Aldridge would play an even bigger role in his destiny. Ezekiel was already 5 years old. The morning sun filtered through the branches of the trees in Greenpoint Park, painting the ground in golden hues as pigeons flew low, competing for breadcrumbs. Sitting on one of the weathered wooden benches, Gideon watched Ezekiel run across the grass, his little feet kicking at dry leaves while he laughed with a freedom that his father fought so hard to preserve. It was one of those rare moments when Gideon allowed himself to forget the weight of the streets, the burden of his secret, the constant presence of fear. There, watching Ezekiel stretch his hands out to the pigeons, imitating their awkward flight, he felt something close to happiness. Ophelia appeared in the distance, waving with a gentle smile. She carried a bag full of fruits and bread, as she always did when she managed to get something extra from the shelter. She approached and, with a natural gesture, handed the bag to Gideon, who accepted it without protest. "He's growing up fast," she commented, watching Ezekiel run to a makeshift swing. Gideon nodded. "It's like overnight he stopped being a baby." Ophelia crossed her arms, leaning back against the bench. "And you? Have you thought about the future?" He averted his gaze. He knew where this conversation was headed. "My future is about making sure he has one," he replied, evasively. Ophelia sighed but didn't press on. It was then that Gideon noticed a group of men in the distance, leaning against a rusty fence at the edge of the park. They were talking in hushed tones, but their posture suggested something was intriguing them. One of them glanced in his direction and whispered something to the others. A chill ran up Gideon's spine. The rumors had begun. That same afternoon, while walking through a nearby alley to the shelter, Gideon overheard fragments of a conversation that made his blood run cold. "I swear, I heard someone say that homeless guy, the one with the kid, has something hidden. Gold or jewelry, maybe. That doesn't make sense. How would he have gotten that?" "Who knows? But if it's true—" The voices faded as he moved away, his heart racing. He had expected this could happen. For years, he had buried the secret along with the bars in the old warehouse, but the whispers were surfacing, and rumors, if not extinguished in time, became dangerous. He spent the rest of the day restless. Any lingering gaze in his direction felt laden with suspicion. He knew he couldn't ignore this. The fear of losing Ezekiel grew stronger by the day. The next morning, upon arriving at the shelter to pick up bread, he was greeted by Ms. Aldridge, who looked at him with a smile that conveyed both kindness and curiosity. "Good morning, Gideon. We need to talk." He felt distrust rising within him. "About what?" She gestured for him to follow her. They walked to a more secluded corner of the shelter, away from curious eyes. "There's a social program that could help you get off the streets, provide a stable home for the boy," she said, looking him directly in the eyes. "I know people who can secure a decent job for you, a small apartment." Gideon swallowed hard. Part of him wanted to accept, but another part knew that it meant opening the door to questions, investigations. He couldn't take that risk. "I appreciate it, Ms. Aldridge, but I'm fine as I am." She studied him for a moment, then tilted her head slightly. "You always shy away from opportunities like this. Any particular reason?" Her gaze was penetrating, and Gideon felt exposed. "I just prefer to do things my way." She sighed, as if she had expected that answer. "If you ever change your mind, the offer will stand." That night, Gideon put Ezekiel to bed early, but he himself couldn't close his eyes. Ms. Aldridge's words echoed in his mind. Was what he was doing right? Or was he just postponing the inevitable? He got up, went to the wooden box, and opened the lid. The metallic shine of the gold bars reflected the faint moonlight streaming through the broken window. If only he could trust them. But he knew he couldn't. A sound outside made him turn quickly. Footsteps. He moved silently to the window's crack and peeked outside. 3 men were walking across the street. One of them, Gideon recognized immediately. He was one of the criminals who nearly killed him years ago when he tried to sell the bar for the first time. His heart raced. He stepped back, keeping his eyes on the men until they disappeared around the corner. They were still nearby. The danger still loomed over his life. And no matter how hard he tried, he wouldn't be able to run forever. The question haunted his mind as he looked at Ezekiel sleeping. How long could he keep his son safe? The night passed without rest for Gideon. After seeing men lurking around the neighborhood, fear had taken root even deeper in his chest. He couldn't let his guard down. As much as he had managed to keep Ezekiel safe so far, he knew that danger was never far away. But that morning, the weight he carried in his chest was different. Today was Ezekiel's first day of school. Since early on, Ms. Aldridge and Ophelia had insisted he enroll the boy in public school, arguing that without an education, he would have few chances for a better future. After much reluctance, Gideon finally gave in. Now, standing in front of the rusty school gate, he felt his muscles tense and his heart race. Ezekiel held his hand, fidgeting, his eyes shining with curiosity and anxiety. "So, I go in here and learn things?" the boy asked, swinging the backpack Ophelia had managed to get for him. Gideon forced a smile. "That's right. You're going to learn a lot of things. And you'll meet kids your age." Ezekiel nodded, but his expression turned serious. "And when class is over, will you be here?" Gideon's gaze softened. Always. Ezekiel hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but only took a deep breath and walked through the gate. Gideon watched him disappear into the hallways. It was the right thing to do. But even so, something inside him said that school would bring new challenges he wasn't prepared to face. In the first week, everything seemed to go well. Ezekiel came home with stories about his teacher, about the new words he was learning, and how he liked the books in the library. But then, things began to change. On a cloudy afternoon, Ezekiel came home quiet. He dropped his backpack on the floor and sat next to Gideon, who immediately noticed the change in mood. "How was your day?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The boy shrugged. "Just like the others." Gideon frowned but didn't want to push. In the following days, he noticed Ezekiel's joy fading a little more each morning before school. Until one night, Ophelia passed by the shelter and found him with his arms crossed, staring at Ezekiel, who kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his eyes red with frustration. "What's going on?" Ophelia asked, sensing the tense atmosphere. Ezekiel hesitated. Gideon looked away, clearly uncomfortable. It was Ophelia who insisted. "Ezekiel, what happened?" The boy clenched his fists and murmured, "They called me trash." The silence that followed was thick. Gideon felt his chest burn. Ophelia crouched down beside Ezekiel. "Who said that?" He bit his lower lip before answering. "Some kids. They said I live in the trash, that I'm dirty. They asked where my house was, and when I couldn't answer, they started laughing." Gideon gritted his teeth. "You don't have to care about that. They know nothing about you." Ezekiel lifted his gaze, and Gideon saw something he had never seen before in his son's eyes: anger. "Tsitsi, but they're right!" Ezekiel shouted, standing up. "Where do we live, Dad? In a crumbling building. We eat scraps, wear donated clothes, and you don't even try to change that." Gideon stood slowly, feeling a knot tighten in his throat. "Ezekiel, why don't you get a job? Why don't we have a home?" Ophelia looked at Gideon, waiting for an answer, but he had none that could be said. Ezekiel's anger turned to hurt, and he lowered his head. "I just wanted to be normal." Gideon felt as though he had taken a punch. Ophelia tried to intervene. "Ezekiel, your dad is doing the best he can." But the boy simply turned away and walked off, swallowing his sobs. Gideon stood frozen, feeling guilt weigh down on him like never before. That night, lying on his makeshift mattress, Ezekiel didn't say a word. Gideon remained silent for a long time before finally saying, "I just wanted you to know that everything I do is for you." But Ezekiel didn't respond. The boy no longer wanted to hear excuses. And Gideon knew that sooner or later he would have to tell him the truth. After all, how much longer could Ezekiel endure living with a father who seemed uninterested in changing their life? The night was cold when Gideon felt the first tremors running through his body. The icy air of Manhattan seemed to penetrate directly into his bones, and the dry cough that had accompanied him for months now came with a metallic taste in his mouth. He tried to disguise it, to hide from Ezekiel how much his body was failing, but the boy was no longer an innocent child. Time had passed too quickly. Ezekiel was now 14 years old. His once round and childish face was more defined, and his eyes had lost some of the innocence of childhood, carrying something that Gideon feared deeply: dissatisfaction. In recent years, the boy had become increasingly questioning. School brought knowledge, but it also brought comparisons. He watched other boys go home at the end of the day, heard classmates talk about family dinners, new clothes, and parties. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, no matter how much he attempted to come to terms with the life he had, a weight was growing in his chest. That night, after yet another difficult day, the storm finally broke. Gideon collapsed on the sidewalk. First, he felt his legs weaken. Then his chest tightened until he could no longer breathe. The last thing he heard before losing consciousness was Ezekiel's desperate voice calling for him. When he regained consciousness, the only thing he could see was the worn white ceiling of Jefferson Public Hospital. The smell of disinfectant and mildew filled the air, and his mouth was dry. He turned his head slowly and saw Ezekiel sitting beside him, his eyes fixed on the floor. "What did the doctor say?" Gideon asked, his voice shaky. Ezekiel didn't respond immediately. His jaw was tense, his hands clenched into fists on his thighs. When he finally looked up, Gideon knew something had changed. "He said you need tests, but there aren't resources here to treat anything serious. They said without money, you can only wait." Silence stretched between them. "Ezekiel, Gideon tried to say something, but the boy interrupted him. "Why have you never tried to have a decent life, Dad?" The words hit Gideon like a punch. The weight of exhaustion and pain kept him from reacting immediately. Ezekiel continued, now standing and beginning to pace back and forth. His voice was heavy with contained rage. "I'm not a child anymore. You always taught me that we need to fight, that we're strong, but what fight is this? I see men every day going to work, doing what they need to do to take care of their families. You just accepted living like this." Gideon felt a knot tighten in his throat. He wanted to scream, to say that he was protecting his son, that there were things he couldn't tell. But how could he explain something so vast? How could he justify years of deprivation when, deep down, there was an exit he simply refused to use? Ezekiel stepped closer, his voice now trembling. "Sue, I hate this life. I hate this misery. I hate having to watch you kill yourself a little more each day while I pretend everything is fine." Gideon closed his eyes. He wanted to say he understood, that he comprehended every piece of that pain, but all that escaped his lips was a whisper, almost inaudible. "I did this for you." Ezekiel let out a bitter laugh. "For me? For me? You want me to believe that? Then tell me, Dad. Tell me what you're hiding." The hospital was too quiet. Even the distant sound of footsteps in the corridor seemed suspended in time. Gideon looked into his son's eyes and saw that he was losing him. For the first time, he realized that the boy no longer saw him as a hero, no longer saw the strong man who held his world together. Ezekiel saw a beggar. He saw a man who had given up fighting. And Gideon realized that, perhaps, this was the greatest injustice he had imposed on himself. But the words wouldn't come. How could he tell the truth now? How could he confess that there was a fortune hidden in an abandoned building, a treasure that could have avoided all of this? How could he share that the fear of losing Ezekiel, the fear of being robbed, the fear that everything would turn into a bigger disaster paralyzed him? He simply couldn't. Ezekiel waited. For a moment, there was a spark of hope in his gaze, as if he were ready to finally hear a real answer. But when he realized that Gideon wouldn't say anything, something broke. "You're a coward." Then he turned his back and left. Gideon tried to get up, but his body didn't respond. He tried to call out to him, but a cough overtook his lungs. The only thing he could do was watch, helpless, as Ezekiel disappeared through the door. He didn't come back that night. Not the next day. Gideon spent 2 days in the hospital before finally leaving, refusing the little treatment he could receive. His mind couldn't focus on anything other than Ezekiel's disappearance. Where was he? Had he gone to school? Had he returned to the shelter? It was Ophelia who found Gideon first. "He's sleeping at a friend's house," she said cautiously. "He's angry, but he's okay." Gideon felt immediate relief, but the pain in his chest remained. He had spent so many years protecting Ezekiel from external dangers that he hadn't realized the greatest risk of all was losing his son's love. Ms. Aldridge also appeared that night. She didn't directly ask about Ezekiel, but her voice carried something close to concern. "You're weak, Gideon. It's time to accept help." He didn't respond. How could he accept help when the only real help he could use was locked in a wooden box, hidden beneath the rubble of an abandoned building? On the 4th night without Ezekiel, he finally returned. Gideon was sitting near the shelter when he saw his son approaching. He looked tired, his eyes red, as if he had slept little or not at all. When he stopped in front of his father, there was no more anger, just a difficult-to-decipher emptiness. For a moment, Gideon thought Ezekiel would say something, but he simply sat down beside him, not looking directly at him. The silence between the two was heavy. Neither of them knew how to take the first step to mend what had been broken. Finally, it was Ezekiel who broke the silence. "You're never going to tell me, are you?" The question came low, but filled with meaning. Gideon swallowed hard. He wanted, how he wanted to tell the truth. But if he spoke, if he revealed that they had gold all along, that they could have lived differently, would Ezekiel understand? Or would he hate him even more? So once again, he remained silent. Ezekiel shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "It's okay," he said, finally getting up. "I don't need to know." He began to walk away, but before disappearing murmured, "Just don't expect me to keep waiting for something that's never going to change." And Gideon knew. He knew he was about to lose Ezekiel for real. Now, what was left for him? If he told the truth, he might lose his son for betrayal. If he remained silent, he would lose him for abandonment. It was a dead-end street. And then, like an overwhelming weight, reality imposed itself. He couldn't hold this secret forever. But when the day of truth arrived, would it be too late to fix everything? Ezekiel is no longer a child, and his frustration with Gideon has reached a breaking point. Their latest argument pushed him away, and now Gideon fears he may lose the son he sacrificed everything for. Meanwhile, shadows from the past are creeping closer. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these powerful stories coming. Now, let's find out what happens next. Thank you. The Knights of Manhattan had always been dangerous, but Gideon felt something had shifted. There was an invisible tension, a weight in the air that made him look over his shoulder more often. Rumors were spreading. In the corner of a dark alley, where the city swallowed the forgotten, a group of men murmured between swigs of cheap booze and worn-out cigarettes. Their faces were etched with the lines of time and the harshness of life, yet there was something more there. Ambition. "I remember him," one of the men said, adjusting his filthy coat while glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "The beggar. The one we almost left to die years ago." Another, taller, nodded slowly, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "And they say he's still around, only now with a kid." The first man laughed, a dry, cynical sound. all the while hoarding treasure and living like a rat. Makes sense. Who else would do that but a damn lunatic? If it's true, the third man, who had been silent until then, finally spoke, squinting his eyes. If he really has something hidden, why the hell hasn't he used it? The group fell silent for a moment. It was a good question, but deep down, it didn't matter why. What mattered was where that treasure was. And, judging by how some homeless folks were talking, it seemed they were getting closer to discovering it. Meanwhile, Gideon felt the weight of his last conversation with Ezekiel. The boy was back at the shelter, but it was as if he were absent. He spoke little, avoided eye contact, and only responded to the essentials. The chasm between them grew wider with each passing day. That night, Ophelia sat next to Gideon. The biting cold of November seeped into the St. Helena shelter, but she watched him with gentle eyes. "You can't keep going on like this, Gideon," she said softly, fiddling with the hem of her own coat. "You're getting worse. You need care." He let out a weak laugh, devoid of humor. "And who would give me that care? They already said, at the hospital. Without money, I'm just another in the line for death." Ophelia sighed, crossing her arms. "You don't trust anyone, do you?" "I trust Ezekiel," he replied without hesitation. She studied him for a moment before saying, "And yet, you're hiding something from him." Gideon swallowed hard. The weight of the secret pressed on his chest. But how could he trust anyone? How could he open that box and show his son something that could destroy him instead of saving him? But for the first time, the words escaped before he could contain them. "Ophelia, I had a choice when I found Ezekiel. I could have left him there. I could have walked away and never looked back." She furrowed her brow. "But you didn't." He shook his head slowly. "No. I picked him up. And along with him, there was something else. Something that changed everything." Ophelia waited, but he didn't continue. Something in his gaze indicated that there was more to say, but he would never reveal it all. "Are you still afraid?" she asked finally. "I'm more afraid than ever." Silence. Gideon knew he couldn't tell the whole truth. But for the first time, he considered stopping his flight from her. Later that night, Gideon returned to the warehouse. The old abandoned building was even more deteriorated than the last time. The smell of mildew and rust hung in the air, and the sound of rats scurrying in the corners echoed through the worn-down walls. His footsteps echoed as he approached the corner where he had buried the box. His hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from the weight of what it represented. As he opened the lid, the 10 gold bars glimmered under the scant light, filtering through the broken windows. Even there, amidst the dust and debris, they seemed to have a glow of their own. A cruel illusion. He reached out, touching one, heavy, cold. A burden he had carried for nearly 15 years. In that moment, for the first time, he considered something he had never allowed himself to think. What if I tell Ezekiel everything? What if I showed him the bars? If I explained why I had never used them? If I said they weren't real gold, but merely a symbolic burden? Would he understand? Or would he hate me even more? Doubt gnawed at Gideon like poison. His eyes closed for a moment. He took a deep breath, trying to decide. But then a sound in the distance made him freeze. Footsteps. Someone was there. Gideon stood still, heart racing. He turned off the makeshift lantern he was using and hid behind a pile of debris. The voices were low but audible. "Someone said he comes here often." "This place is huge. If he's hidden something, it won't be easy to find. Gideon felt his stomach churn. They were after the gold. His greatest fear was coming true. He held his breath, hoping they would leave. But the footsteps continued. What do we do if we find it? What do you think? We take it. And if he tries to resist, we deal with him. Gideon's blood ran cold. The men prowled for a few minutes, searching. Luckily, they were far from the box, but he knew it wouldn't be long before they found it. When they finally left, he exhaled slowly. He had waited too long. Time was running out. The legend of the treasure was no longer just a distant rumor. Now, it was a real danger. If he didn't take action, sooner or later, they would discover everything. And if that happened, neither he nor Ezekiel would be safe. The pain was unbearable. Gideon tried to hold on to something, but his legs gave way, and he fell to his knees on the filthy floor of the storage room. The metallic taste of blood surged up his throat and dripped from his lips, staining the floor red. His eyes fluttered as his breathing became erratic. He knew time was running out. Outside, the city continued its indifferent course. The distant sound of sirens, hurried footsteps on the wet sidewalks, the muffled murmurs from the alleys. Everything blended into a confusing whirlwind. And then darkness. Ezekiel didn't know how to react. He found his father lying on the ground, his skin pale as wax, his eyes half closed, trying to say something that wouldn't come out. Panic gripped the young man's chest. "Dad!" He knelt beside him, shaking him gently. "Dad, talk to me!" A dry, rasping cough was the only response. Ophelia, who had been right behind him, gasped at the sight. "My God, we need to take him now!" The night transformed into a sequence of blurred images. Ezekiel and Ophelia practically dragged Gideon through the cold streets to the hospital. The weight of the fragile man in his son's arms seemed to double with every step. Jefferson Public Hospital was like any other free hospital in the city. Overcrowded, noisy, and impersonal. Doctors and nurses rushed back and forth, trying to balance scarce resources with constant emergencies. A team on duty rushed to attend to Gideon as soon as they realized the severity of the situation. "Internal bleeding," murmured one of the doctors, pressing on his chest to stabilize his breathing. "We need an immediate transfusion." Ezekiel gripped the edge of the stretcher as they took his father away. His fingers were white from the strength he applied. "He's going to be okay, right?" he asked, his voice choked. The doctor hesitated before answering. "We need tests, but he requires specialized treatment, something this hospital can't provide." Ezekiel felt a fury rising within him. The same cycle, over and over. Poverty always denying his father a real chance of survival. "Oh, how much does it cost?" he asked, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. The doctor looked away. "A lot." Ezekiel took a deep breath, his hands trembling. He glanced at Ophelia and Ms. Aldridge, who had just arrived. None of them seemed to have an answer. It was then that Gideon opened his eyes. His vision was blurry, the pain excruciating, but his weak hand rose, gripping his son's arm with surprising strength. "The box!" he gasped. "Go to the storage. Get the wooden box." Ezekiel frowned, confused. "Dad, you need to rest." "No!" The voice came out like a grunt, almost a last breath. His hand fell onto his chest. He was unconscious again. Ezekiel hesitated. He looked at Ophelia and then at Ms. Aldridge, who simply nodded. If he asked for it, it must be important. With his heart racing and his mind swirling with questions, Ezekiel rushed out of the hospital, running through the dark streets toward the old abandoned storage room. The place was shrouded in a grim silence when he arrived. The air smelled of mold, dust, and dampness. Each step echoed too loudly for his liking. He turned on his phone's flashlight, the flickering light dancing over the scattered debris. He walked to the corner where his father always seemed to linger longer than necessary. And then he saw it. The wooden box, worn by time, lay hidden beneath loose boards. His heart beat so hard that it felt like it was echoing through the entire storage room. With trembling fingers, he pulled the box closer. The latch was rusty, but gave way with a soft click. Ezekiel lifted the lid. The golden shine reflected on his face. He blinked, dazed. There lay 10 gleaming bars of gold. A heavy silence fell over him. The world seemed to spin and distort. His father had this all along? Ezekiel squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to believe what he saw. He picked up one of the bars and felt its weight. It was real. It had to be real. Gideon's words in the hospital hammered in his mind. "You've had this all along?" His voice echoed in the emptiness. The last few years of suffering flashed through his mind like a whirlwind. The cold nights, the hunger, the shame at school, the pitying looks. All of that could have been avoided. Anger surged within him, crushing any other emotion. He grabbed the box and held it tightly. If his father wouldn't use that gold to save himself, then he would. He stormed out of the storage room, feeling the frantic pulse within him. When he returned to the hospital, Ophelia and Ms. Aldridge were waiting for him. Ezekiel slammed the box down on the reception desk with a dull thud. "How much does his treatment cost?" The receptionist looked at him, surprised. "Excuse me?" He opened the lid, revealing the gold bars. "This should be enough, right?" The woman's eyes widened, completely taken aback. Ophelia placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. "Ezekiel." But he shrugged her off, furious. "No, you don't understand. He had this all along, and he let me believe we were destitute. He let me go hungry." His eyes were welling with tears. "But I won't let him die because of this madness." Before anyone could intervene, the emergency room door swung open violently. Gideon stood there, pale as death, his eyes wide. "No!" Ezekiel froze. His father stumbled forward, clutching his chest as if he had gathered his last strength to rise from the stretcher and run over. "You can't sell that!" he gasped, his voice trembling. Ezekiel pointed at the box, still incredulous. "Why, Dad? Why is this more important than your life?" Gideon stumbled, gripping the edge of the counter. His body trembled, but he looked at his son with an intensity that made Ezekiel hold his breath. "Because this was never for me." Ezekiel blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Gideon swallowed hard, trying to catch his breath. "That gold, it's to save you, not me." Shock crossed Ezekiel's face. The entire hospital seemed to freeze. Everyone awaited Gideon's answer. But he didn't have time. His body finally gave out. Gideon collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Ezekiel screamed. Doctors rushed from all sides. The box was forgotten on the counter as they took Gideon into the emergency room. Ezekiel couldn't move. What did he mean by that? Ophelia held his hand, but Ezekiel didn't even notice. All he could see was the emergency room door closing. And the only certainty he had was that if he didn't do something quickly, he might never get the answer. Ezekiel stood there, frozen, as he watched the doctors take Gideon back to the emergency room. The world seemed to spin around him, the sounds becoming muffled and distant. He wanted to run after his father, demand answers, but he knew this moment wasn't about him. Whatever was happening inside that room, he couldn't control it. His gaze fell on the open wooden box on the reception desk. The gold bars still gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the hospital, a shine that now seemed to mock him. Everything could have been different. All those cold nights, all the humiliations, all the hunger. Ezekiel slammed the lid of the box shut. "This ends now." Ophelia approached, hesitantly. "Ezekiel!" "Don't try to stop me," he growled, lifting the box. "If my father wants to die out of pride, that's his problem. But I won't watch that happen." Miss Aldridge, who was nearby, watched with a heavy look of concern. "What if he's right?" "Right about what?" Ezekiel turned, anger burning in his chest. "About letting us go hungry when we had this fortune hidden away? About refusing help because he's too stubborn?" The elderly woman sighed. "Have you ever wondered why he never sold a single one of those bars?" He hesitated. Of course, he had thought about it. Since he was a child, Gideon had never mentioned the existence of that gold. He had never even hinted that they had a way out of their misery. But at that moment, he didn't want to think. He wanted to act. "I'm going to sell it, and with that money, I'm going to save my father's life, whether he wants it or not." Without waiting another second, Ezekiel stormed out of the hospital, clutching the box tightly. Ophelia ran after him. "Do you even know where to sell this?" He took a deep breath, his steps firm. "If I go to the wrong people, they'll try to kill me. If I go to a bank, they'll ask about the origin of the bars and call the police. So what now?" He looked at the woman beside him. "Do you know anyone who won't ask questions?" Ophelia hesitated for a moment. Then she sighed. "I know a jeweler. He's not the type to ask too many questions, but he also doesn't do business with just anyone." "I have gold. That should be enough." She stared at him for a long moment before nodding. The place was small, discreet, hidden among other shops in the city's suburbs. The faded sign indicated that the jewelry store was closed, but Ophelia knocked on the side door insistently. A few seconds later, a short man with graying hair and an analytical gaze opened the door just enough to peek out. "Ophelia?" "I need a favor, Robert." The man frowned and then opened the door wider to let them in. Ezekiel didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, placed the box on the glass counter, and opened the lid. The golden shine reflected in the jeweler's eyes. Robert raised his eyebrows. "Where did you get this?" "Doesn't matter. I want to sell it." The man scoffed, pulling on a pair of gloves and picking up one of the bars. He turned it over in his fingers, weighing it in his palm, and then took a thin blade and scraped the surface. Ezekiel crossed his arms, impatient. "What are you waiting for?" Robert remained silent. He took a small bottle of acid and dripped a few drops onto the area scraped by the blade. That's when it happened. The golden shine began to dissolve. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Ezekiel blinked. What's happening?" Robert let out a long sigh. "This isn't gold." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Ezekiel's feet. "What do you mean, it's not gold?" The jeweler picked up another bar, repeated the test. The result was the same. He pushed the box back toward Ezekiel. "This is common metal, cheap gold plating." Ezekiel felt the blood drain from his face. But he kept this for so long, he couldn't finish the sentence. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in his mind. Gideon had never known. He had believed all those years that he had a fortune. He had spent his whole life hiding something that was worthless. Ezekiel felt a knot in his throat. All the suffering, all the times they had gone hungry, all the cold nights, all the arguments, all the choices made to preserve a secret that, in the end, didn't exist. He gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. Ophelia placed a hand on his shoulder, but he pulled away. I have to go back to the hospital. He grabbed the box, pressing it against his chest, and ran outside. The way back felt like a blur. The weight of the box in his arms was unbearable, but he couldn't let it go. He needed to show Gideon. When he finally reached the hospital, he dashed past the reception desk, through the hallways, and through the emergency doors until he found Ms. Aldridge kneeling in the corner of the waiting room. She was praying. Ezekiel's stomach churned. "Where is he?" The elderly woman looked up. "His condition has worsened. The doctors—" He didn't wait for the answer. He ran to the door of the room. And then he stopped. Through the glass window, he saw his father lying on the stretcher. Gideon was motionless. The young man's breath hitched. He grasped the doorknob, but hesitated. The knot in his throat tightened. He didn't know if he still had time. But he knew he needed to go in. And he needed to go in now. Ezekiel entered the room, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. The wooden box was still in his arms, but now it felt empty. Insignificant. He approached the bed where Gideon lay, the tubes connected to his frail body rising and falling with each labored breath. The slow beep of the heart monitor echoed in the room, filling the silence like a countdown he didn't want to accept. "Dad." His voice came out choked, the words caught in his throat. Gideon opened his eyes with difficulty, his clouded vision fixing on his son's face. For a moment, he seemed lost, but then a weak smile appeared on his cracked lips. "Zeke, you came back." Ezekiel held his father's hand, feeling it cold, the skin wrinkled like thin paper. I'm back. And He didn't know how to say it. How could he tell? How could he explain that everything, all the choices, the sacrifices, were based on something that never existed? Gideon squeezed his hand with the little strength he had left. "You are okay?" The young man closed his eyes, feeling tears streaming down his face. What mattered now? Gideon never knew. He never refrained from selling those bars, not because he chose not to, but because he believed in their value. He died believing he was protecting something precious for his son. And now Ezekiel understood. The treasure was never the gold. It was what his father did to raise him. It was the love, the dedication, the sacrifice. He buried his face in his father's hand and sobbed. "I'm okay, Dad." Gideon smiled a little more. His gaze drifted for a moment, as if he were seeing something beyond that cold hospital room. "You are a good boy, Zeke, a good man." Ezekiel's chest ached. He wanted to hold on to that moment, stretch it out, make it last longer, but the beeping of the monitor slowed with each passing second. "I tried to protect you," Gideon murmured. "It was never about gold." Ezekiel swallowed hard and squeezed his father's hand tighter. "I know, Dad, I know." The old man smiled one last time before closing his eyes. The monitor emitted a continuous sound. Ezekiel stayed there, holding Gideon's lifeless hand, until the doctors entered the room and began removing the tubes. He heard the words, "time of death," but his mind was already distant. He felt Ophelia approach and touch his shoulder, but he couldn't react. His father was gone. The funeral took place in a forgotten corner of the city, far from the luxurious cemeteries. A small group of people attended. Residents of the shelter, a few souls who had crossed Gideon's path over the years. Ophelia, Ms. Aldridge. Ezekiel did not cry. Not there. He just watched the dirt being thrown over the simple coffin, feeling that a part of him was being buried alongside his father. When it was all over, and the people began to leave, he stood there, staring at the grave. Ophelia approached, holding something. "I found this inside the wooden box," she said, extending a small folded piece of paper to him. Ezekiel took it with trembling fingers and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, worn, as if it had been written during moments of fragility. "My son, what I found that night was not gold, but you." Ezekiel's vision blurred. He pressed the paper against his chest, his knees buckling. "Now," he cried. Time passed. Days turned into months, and Ezekiel felt the weight of his father's absence in each of them. But something changed inside him. The past could not be altered, but what Gideon left behind could still transform lives. He sought out Ophelia and Ms. Aldridge and made a request. "I want to create something, a place to help people like my father." They didn't question him, they just helped. And thus, the Gideon Foundation was born. Without money, without gold, just a moving story and Ezekiel's determination. In the beginning, it was tough. But when people heard the story of the man who spent his whole life believing he had a fortune and chose not to touch it to protect his son, donations began to flow in. Newspapers published the story. People came to help. Gradually, the foundation grew. Ezekiel dedicated his life to it. Not out of guilt, not out of regret, but because he knew that was what his father would have done. Years later, on a cold, rainy night, Ezekiel walked the streets of Manhattan. Time had passed, and he was no longer the skinny kid who had once been ashamed of his father. Now he understood. He stopped in a dark alley and saw a child huddled among the trash bags, shivering from the cold. The scene hit him like a punch to the chest. Without hesitation, he knelt down. The little girl had big, scared eyes. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly. She looked at him, hesitant. "Are you hungry?" She nodded timidly. Ezekiel smiled. "Then let's find a warm place, okay?" He picked her up and stepped out of the alley, shielding her from the rain. And in that moment, he knew his father was still with him. Because the true gold was never what you could hold in your hands. It was what you carried in your heart. Life teaches us that true wealth isn't measured in gold, but in the love, sacrifice, and values we pass on. Gideon lived and died believing in a treasure, but in the end, his greatest fortune was Ezekiel, a son shaped by resilience, integrity, and compassion. Even without riches, he left behind a legacy of love that changed lives, proving that what we do for others is what truly remains. This story reminds us that sometimes what we think is holding us back is actually shaping us into something greater. What about you? What would you do if you had a fortune but knew it could change someone's heart forever? And what did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, click on the next video appearing on your screen. Thank you for watching.